that you might have been mistaken?
No, Mr. Rumpole. I won't accept that possibility. I know what I saw.
We've all seen enough courtroom dramas to know that the case often depends on what the eyewitnesses have to say. But just how reliable is their evidence? I've come to the University of California, Irvine, to meet the highest-ranking woman in the top 100 psychologists of the 20th century. Elizabeth Loftus is the psychologist whose work changed forever the way courts treat eyewitness evidence.
You call this program Mind Changers, and I think Elizabeth Loftus has been not just a mind changer, but a game changer as well. Her work has had theoretical implications in that she's changed the way we think about memory. That's being a mind changer, but it's also a changed practice. So she's also been a game changer.
Her work has made psychology more influential in the world.
In a way, what she's done is taken very simple, almost familiar memory phenomena, but she's shown the relevance of them to really important parts of life.
Elizabeth Loftus is professor here at the University of California, Irvine, of both law and psychology, and I've come to her house on the campus to meet her. Hello.
Hi.
I'm Claudia from the BBC.
Nice to meet you.
Death and the collection of people who work around these topics of law and psychology seem to me to have made fundamental contributions that could make our society a better place.
When a judge or a juror hears somebody in court testifying based on memory, you need to know, were there aspects of the witness's experience, either at the time of the event or afterwards, that contaminated or distorted the memory in order to know whether you should be convicting people on the basis of it.
What she did was convincingly and compellingly demonstrate something that no cognitive psychologists ever doubted. She just did it in a particularly dramatic and powerful way so that people outside psychology had to take notice.
The idea that memory works like a videotape and you just record the event and play it back later is an idea that lay people hold on to. But in fact, the research shows that that's simply not a good description of how memory works. Memory is constructive or reconstructive, and we're actually taking bits and pieces of experience and binding them together to produce what feels like a memory.
And what gave you the idea for starting on the studies on how accurate eyewitness memory is?
We were looking at semantic memory, which is memory for words and concepts and how information is organized in our long-term memories, information that we know well. But I had a conversation with a cousin of mine who was a lawyer, and she asked me, have you made any discoveries? And I told her we could measure how long it took people to give you the name of an animal that starts with the letter Z, and she just didn't seem very impressed with it. She wanted to know how much the government paid to have that particular finding discovered. It got me thinking that I really would like to be able to do work that has more obvious practical relevance.
That was in the early 1970s. It was virtually unknown for psychologists to use film simulations of the kind of events you'd find in real life. So Loftus had an entirely novel approach.
One of the early studies we did was to show people a simulated accident, and afterwards we asked people about the speed of the vehicles involved in the accident. But we questioned different witnesses in different ways. So some were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Others were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And we found that our subjects told us that the cars were going a lot faster if we used the word smashed than the word hit. We brought people back a week later. We want to ask you more questions about that accident. Oh, by the way, did you see any broken glass? And we found that of those to whom we had earlier asked the smashed question, they were more likely to tell us they remembered broken glass. In fact, there was no broken glass at all. It meant the early question was influencing the answer to the later question, but the witness is seeing the broken glass that he or she constructed in the mind.
My own work is in perception, how people see things. And if you study perception, you're very well aware that the brain is always making stuff up, that you see things and the brain interprets it. With memory, people don't have that as a natural feeling. You tend to believe yourself. You don't normally doubt your memory.
Brian Wandell is Professor of Psychology at Stanford University and a long-time friend of Elizabeth Loftus. He believes her work has done a lot to challenge the idea that memory is like a videotape.
Beth's insight that memory is a brain function like perception, and that just as perception is making inferences about what's immediately in front of you, memory is making inferences about what must have happened in the past. And just as your perceptual inferences can be influenced by the context and what's just happened and so forth, your memory constructs that you're rebuilding can be influenced. And boy, she saw that, and better than just seeing it and writing a bunch of papers and difficult to read journals, she went out there and explained why that would matter in eyewitness testimony.
Later, the phenomenon would be labeled the misinformation effect. When you feed people misinformation, either via leading questions, as we did in the original study, or allowing a witness to hear another witness's version, exposing a witness to media coverage about an event, this new information can and does impair the memory that the witness might have stored.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God?
How easy was it for you to get the legal system interested in your research once you'd done it? I mean, now you've been an expert witness in many, many court cases, but presumably that took a while, did it, to get them interested?
Attorneys wanted expert testimony on the factors that can influence eyewitness accuracy. But many judges were reluctant to admit this expert testimony.
Elizabeth Loftus.
What is your occupation or profession?
I'm a professor of psychology.
Eventually, what happened is a murder case in Arizona. Dolan Chappell was convicted because the eyewitness was very convincing to the jury. And the Arizona Supreme Court, when they got the appeal, based on the grounds that the expert testimony had not been allowed, the Arizona Supreme Court reversed the conviction.
That was in 1983. Since then, Elizabeth Loftus and other psychologists have provided expert opinion on the reliability of eyewitness testimony in countless trials. But as jurors, we continue to find such witnesses extremely compelling. What could be more convincing than someone who states categorically, "I was there and I saw what happened"? Yet Loftus has demonstrated that even the most confident witness can be mistaken. And she's inspired others to explore just how far we can rely on our memories. Barbara Tversky is now Emerita Professor of Psychology at Stanford, where she showed that we don't need a questioner from outside to plant distorted memories. We can do it perfectly well ourselves.
Some of this work came after the '89 earthquake here. People would tell their own earthquake stories, and then you saw stories getting embellished, getting better, sometimes maybe incorporating details from somebody else's earthquake story and so forth. And we thought, this is a phenomenon that the way you tell something, it brings in certain information and excludes other information, because the overall spin that you put on it becomes a retrieval cue for information.
This does make you wonder how much you should even believe your own memory.
Yeah.
We seem to have this faith in memory and think of it as being a bit like a video recording of what happened, and it's not.
When we listen to stories or read them, we often form very vivid images, just as vivid as things that happen to us, and later we can confuse them.
We met at 9.
We met at 8.
I was on time.
No, you were late.
Ah, yes? I remember it well. We dined with friends.
We dined alone.
A tenor sang.
A baritone.
Ah, yes. I remember it well.
But in legal matters, these mistaken memories can have a devastating impact.
After case after case after case, where the major reasons for the wrongful conviction included faulty eyewitness testimony, our Justice Department convened a committee of prosecutors, defense attorneys, police, psychologists to come up with guidelines for law enforcement on how they should handle witnesses at every stage. And that guide for law enforcement has been published, and it's based on psychological science. So it's something that we in the field are very proud of.
And in the UK too, the law has taken notice of psychological research. Gillian Cohen is retired Professor of Psychology from the Open University.
It was realised that the methods used in police interviews are often very poor and quite often counterproductive. because interviewers may ask biased questions or even hint quite strongly at the answers they're expecting. When people became aware of this through Loftus's work, there were new and improved interview techniques that were developed. One such is called the cognitive interview.
Greater Manchester Police have been using the cognitive interview since the early 1990s. Steve Retford is a specialist interview advisor with the major incident team there.
What we had prior to that was nothing. You used to look at the way more experienced colleagues would interview people, you know, rapport and things like that. What the cognitive interview gave a practitioner was a set of guidance criteria to operate to. Open questions you don't want, leading questions, or questions that might confuse. And we have a very simple guidance, 5WH questions: who, why, what, where, when and how. And then in addition to that, we have TED questions: tell, explain, describe.
But even the cognitive interview will only work if the witness is questioned before their memory of the event can get contaminated. Dr. Lorraine Hope, who's a reader in applied cognitive psychology at the University of Portsmouth, has found that this is a particular problem when there's more than one witness. Her research was inspired by Elizabeth Loftus.
Basically, if you can change just one word in a question and change their memory for what they actually saw themselves, that's a revelation. It opened up a whole new world of how something I was really interested in, memory and how memory works, can actually inform something really important like legal outcomes.
Where have you been able to take this work in practice? What can you actually do to make witnesses better and more reliable?
We work a lot with the police. They reported to us that if there's a major event with 30, 40, 100 witnesses, we cannot interview all those witnesses immediately. Obviously, if you're one of the witnesses who isn't contacted for a month or longer, you've forgotten some of the information you've seen, you've heard something about it in the media, you've discussed it with friends, and so your memory is becoming more and more distorted, not as detailed, and hence not as useful to the police. So what we have been working on is a tool called the self-administered interview. We try and capture in the greatest possible detail, as soon as possible after the event, what the witness has actually seen for themselves.
And so you've got a copy of it here, the self-administered interview that's used by Greater Manchester Police. Lots of blank pages. Presumably this is so they can write whatever happens.
It uses the major components from the cognitive interview to encourage the witness to report their account in their own language, provides them with memory cues to help them do that.
So the idea is that by filling in the self-administered interview, people put down their initial memories of it before they can be spoilt by anything else, if you
Absolutely.
like. They get those facts straight in their own head, in a way.
Yes, they get those straight and they lock them down. And subsequent studies we've done have shown that that's where the advantage of the SEI comes from preserving and protecting that detailed initial account.
It's of absolute godsend to an investigator because you're not losing witnesses. When I started in the job some considerable time ago, the thought of working hand in glove with a psychologist developing interviewing techniques was just completely alien to the environment and the culture that existed then. As the years have gone by and I've seen the benefits of the products that these people research and develop, it's a win-win. Professor Loftus is world renowned. I was very fortunate to see her speak at a conference of psychology and law at Edinburgh University, and is certainly one of the big names.
Loftus' friend of more than 30 years standing, Brian Wandell, believes the key to her success can be seen in her creative approach to something she's less skilled at.
Cooking is not her strong suit. She cooked this, and it was supposed to be this light, airy thing, and it was, you know, about as thick as concrete. And she brought it out to the guests. They gave it a little bit of a miss. But then the next week when they had other guests over for bridge, she brought it out again. And instead of presenting it as lemon meringue or whatever, it was just, these are Greek torts. And they ate them and they said, could we have the recipe for this? This was really delicious and thick and chewy and so forth. And for me, that sort of captures something about Beth. When you're in the research environment, being creative and being capable of seeing how to turn a problem into something that's interesting and something that people come to see something that they hadn't seen before, boy, that's a real great skill.
With her worldwide reputation now well established, it comes as a surprise to discover that at Stanford University in the 1960s, Elizabeth Loftus was voted the least likely postgraduate student to succeed in psychology. Gordon Bauer, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Stanford, was one of her tutors at the time.
She was in a very brilliant collection of young PhD students, several of whom have gone on to fabulous careers. Beth did not stand out because she wasn't doing the kind of work at that time that would have made her a fabulous career. That started a little later. I have a photograph of her with the rest of us in a class of mathematical psychology, which was a very gender-related field at the time, probably still is. And Beth stands out as being the only woman in about 28 males. She was a very outgoing person. She had the facility for moving around and talking to people. Everybody knew Beth. She was a force.
From the very beginning, she was that odd combination of somebody who was deadly serious and ambitious in her work, yet someone who really wanted to have a good time and was extremely social.
Lee Ross is also now emeritus.
If we said who's most likely to end up being very controversial, she might well have been voted that role. She certainly fulfilled that.
Because where her memory research took Elizabeth Loftus next was to land her in the middle of a huge controversy.
Some of these individuals would write letters to my department chair or president of my university trying to get me fired. They would send me hate mail or hate email. They would use all sorts of profanity. You know, life was sometimes pretty miserable with their efforts to retaliate or to lash out at an opinion that they didn't like.
So Elizabeth Loftus had found that she could distort memories and get people to add bits of information. But what about implanting a whole new memory? She was outside a shopping mall like this one when she had an idea.
When I first got involved in a case where there were allegations of repressed memory, a woman claimed that she had seen her father kill her best friend and repressed the memory for 20 years, and now the memory was back, and they were prosecuting her father for murder. And she claimed that she had repressed her memory not only for witnessing this murder when she was 8 years old, but for years and years of sexual brutalization that he had committed upon her. I began to look and see where did this idea of repression come from and what's the evidence for it, and was actually shocked to find that there was no credible scientific support for this commonly held belief. And yet this man accused of murder was convicted based on nothing other than this repressed memory of his daughter. I didn't believe the memories were real. I thought that they had come about through a process of suggestion and imagination, but how could you demonstrate that you could plant a whole memory like that? Not just change a little detail here and there, but a whole memory. And I and my collaborators did come up with the idea, let's see if we can get people to believe that when they were 5 or 6 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall. They were frightened and crying and rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. And we were able to plant that kind of a false memory, either completely or partially, in about a quarter of our subjects with 3 suggestive interviews.
So how on earth could you go about convincing somebody that when they were little they got lost in a mall?
We took our subjects and we said to them, you know, we've talked to your mother or your father or your older sibling, and we found out some things that happened to you when you were about 5 or 6 years old. We want to ask you about those experiences. Now, we really had talked to the relative, and we found from the relative 3 true memories, things that really did happen to our adult subject when he was 5 or 6 years old. And then with the relative, we crafted a false memory. And after we did that Lost in the Mall study, people criticized it. They said, well, getting lost is really common.
Oh, so it might have happened to somebody.
Yeah, so I thought, we're going to have to plant a memory of something that would be impossible so that we know it couldn't have happened. And that was the genesis of our idea, to try to get people to remember that on a childhood trip to Disney, they met and shook hands with Bugs Bunny. That's impossible because Bugs Bunny is a Warner Brothers character and would not be allowed at a Disney property. And yet we were able, through a suggestive manipulation, to get a sizable minority of people to tell us they remembered meeting Bugs Bunny at Disney.
It was still just a minority who did believe it.
In some studies, it has been as high as a half. On the average, it's about a third of the time. I think that's a sizable percentage. But it is also important to keep in mind that 2/3 of the time people are saying, no, I just don't remember that. Now I say, just give me a little more time with a person and a few more opportunities to keep working on them, and I'll get a bunch of them to start to remember it too.
Getting involved in cases about repressed memories of alleged sexual assaults and child abuse has obviously been a controversial area for you, and you've had to put up with lots of criticism.
I was trying to speak out publicly about what I saw as a serious mental health crisis, but it did not endear me to a lot of people. And the repressed memory therapists, the ones who were doing therapy that helped, I would say, create what people thought were repressed memories, some of the patients who had those, what they thought were repressed memories, they were very angry.
The broad issue shouldn't have been controversial. Lots of kids are abused. They remember it perfectly well. That part was undeniably true. What it came in conflict with was an issue that was as old as Freud, whether people can have memories that are completely repressed, but that by somehow or other removing the source of the blockage are recovered. Are those memories authentic? It's impossible to prove a negative. So you can't prove that there are no such instances, and there may well be some. You can prove that one can produce memories that are inauthentic, and that's what Beth did. And she wasn't intimidated. That didn't come as a surprise to those of us who knew her. She's been absolutely fearless.
She was trying to do honest work and trying to be fair about what basic science could tell us about the likelihood of these recovered memories. And she ran into a steamroller of anger and people just not being willing to look at scientific data.
And it sounds as though she didn't let all this very hard time that she had put her off studying that area. She wasn't frightened away.
It was the same thing, lemon meringue, the Greek torts, you know, she takes what life throws at her and she makes something out of it. Always been that way.
Isn't the problem with the repressed memory cases, aren't they sometimes going to be true? That they do get a memory back of what someone really did to them?
Of course it's the case that people can not think about things for a long time and be reminded of them later. They can even not think about very unpleasant things and be reminded of them later and be accurate about it. You just have to go to a high school reunion and you can experience that for yourself. But we're not talking about ordinary forgetting and reminding of a memory. When you invoke the idea of repressed memory, the idea is there was such horrible brutalization. It was banished into the unconscious, walled off from the rest of mental life, and now you can somehow go in there and dig out some pristine record of that experience. And there's some process involved in this that is beyond ordinary forgetting and remembering. That's what's being claimed here, and that's what many of us argue there is no credible scientific support for.
So you think that's never possible?
I just think it's not proven. Maybe one day they'll figure out a way to prove that there is something like this going on in the mind. But until that day, I don't think we should be throwing people in prison based on an allegation of a repressed memory and nothing else.
But can situations as serious as these really be researched through laboratory studies which might feel inconsequential to the people taking part? Gillian Cohen is among those who've questioned whether the experimental conditions Loftus created with her simulations can really be compared with real-life witness situations.
What has been found is that whether the witness statement really is going to have a serious consequence makes a big difference to how valid and how verifiable and true the report is. Because it does sometimes seem to happen that the work done in the lab doesn't appear to the people taking part to be something that is very important. There are no particular consequences that flow from it. So maybe they are not as careful.
It's tempting, reading Elizabeth Loftus's work, to concentrate on the fact that false memories can be implanted in some people. But it's actually not everybody, is it?
No, indeed it isn't. It's also interesting, I think, to think about what factors can make people more or less susceptible to that kind of misinformation. Elderly people tend to be more susceptible, and children tend to be more susceptible. So I guess we're a bit better at it in middle age. And levels of stress are also important. People in a very high stress state or a very low stress state are more susceptible to misinformation.
And I suppose in real-life situations, it is often going to be a high-stress situation where somebody has to identify someone they've seen committing a crime.
Particularly if they were looking down the barrel of a gun at the time, which tends to mean that they don't notice very much else at all and have very little recall of the surrounding context.
And now Elizabeth Loftus's research is taking a rather different direction, but making use of the same theories. I'm in a diner in a small town in California, and I have in front of me a bowl of strawberry ice cream. Delicious, but a bit fattening, of course, and hard to resist. So could the implantation of false memories involving strawberry ice cream succeed in putting me off it?
I wanted to look at what happens when you succeed in planting a false memory in somebody's mind. Does it have consequences for people? Will it affect their later behaviors or intentions or thoughts? My collaborators and I hit upon the idea, why don't we see if we can plant a false memory that you got sick eating a particular food? Because if we plant a false memory that you got sick eating a particular food, people might avoid those foods. Just like when they really get sick on something, they sometimes develop taste aversions and don't want to eat it or drink it anymore.
So Loftus is staying with the application of psychology to real life, but there's a long way to go with this research in the field of dieting, and that's before we even start on the ethical issues. Meanwhile, Loftus distills the message of her work to a single lesson that she hopes we can all now learn.
When somebody tells you something, just because they're confident, just because they're detailed, and just because they're emotional when they tell you what they think is a memory, doesn't mean it really happened.
That carriage ride.
You walked me home.
You lost a glove.
I lost a comb.
My husband and I at some point argued. I was retelling a memory, and he said, that didn't happen to you. That happened to me. And we never could come to agreement on who it had happened to. I have a strong feeling it happened to me. He's convinced it happened to him. I don't know how to settle it.
I remember it well.